The galactic Concord was a majestic, sprawling entity, a tapestry woven from thousands of species across countless star systems. It was a monument to order, to pragmatic cooperation, and to the relentless pursuit of knowledge that could be measured, quantified, and applied. Science, engineering, resource management, and flawlessly logical economic models were the pillars upon which its vast society was built. Their interspecies cultural exchanges were usually showcases of technological marvels or breakthroughs in quantum physics, not, well, not the things humanity often brought to the table. Humans were the bright, boisterous newcomers to this ancient assembly. They had been welcomed with a sort of avuncular curiosity. Their energy was undeniable, their capacity for rapid innovation intriguing. However, their deep, almost spiritual reverence for what the conquered generally termed nonlinear abstract data constructs, or as humans called them, stories, art, music, and mythology, was a source of polite bafflement. These pursuits were deemed charming, frivolous, a way for a young species to expend its restless energy. Human cultural exports, their holovids, their symphonies, their endless stream of written narratives, were consumed by other conquered species as one might enjoy a peculiar exotic sweet. Pleasant, momentarily diverting, but of no real substance. Archivist Krell, a Zalosian information broker, was a being of meticulous data purity. The Zalosians, with their crystalline minds and intricate internal databanks, were the self-appointed librarians of the conquered. Krell's life was dedicated to the collection, collation, and verification of facts. When humanity began uploading its cultural archives to the conquered central repository, Krell had been assigned the initial cataloging. It had been an experience. The sheer volume was staggering, but it was the nature of the content that truly perplexed Krell. So many variations of similar events, so many accounts that directly contradicted known physics or history, so many fabrications presented with such earnestness. Krell had privately classified the bulk of human storytelling as a delightful, if highly inefficient, form of organized, informational deviation. The dismissal of humanity's narrative obsessions was often subtle, but consistently present. At a recent Concord Grand Assembly on Resource Allocation, a human delegate, Dr. Eris Thorne, had attempted to illustrate a complex point about sustainable societal models by referencing an ancient Earth myth about a king who demanded too much from a goose that laid golden eggs. After a moment of profound silence, the presiding mechanoid of the assembly had tilted its optical sensor. Delegate Thorne, your anecdotal allegory is noted. However, the Council would prefer to proceed with empirical data sets and predictive algorithms regarding resource depletion. Please confine your contributions to quantifiable metrics. Dr. Thorne had nodded, a faint flush rising on his neck, and sat down. Another time, a human artist, renowned on Earth for her evocative empathy sculptures, had been invited to contribute a piece to the new Galactic Unity Plaza. Her work, a swirling vortex of light and shadow designed to evoke the feeling of interconnectedness through shared vulnerability, was placed in a quiet, seldom visited alcove. The central plaza, meanwhile, was dominated by a colossal, hyper-efficient energy matrix designed by the Bolidians, which also, incidentally, powered the plaza's climate control. Practicality, the conquered seemed to agree, always trumped poetics. Human stories were for quiet moments of leisure, not for the serious business of galactic governance or understanding the universe. The first whispers of the anomaly came from the periphery, from those remote conquered worlds often considered backwaters. The reports were vague, dismissed initially as localized social unrest or mass hysteria, but they spread. The symptoms were insidious, not overtly violent, but deeply corrosive. It started with a creeping apathy, a disinterest in cultural traditions. Then came a loss of shared purpose, an erosion of the foundational beliefs that bound communities together. Species with millennia of recorded history began to forget why their history mattered. It was as if the color was draining from their civilizations, leaving behind a dull, listless gray. They called it the gray fade. It wasn't a virus that attacked the body, but a mimetic plague that targeted the mind, specifically, the narratives that gave meaning to existence. It was an information-based contagion, spreading through the Concord's vast communication networks, latching onto shared cultural artifacts, even whispering through simple conversations. It didn't kill its victims, it hollowed them out. It made their most cherished stories, their creation myths, their tales of heroism and love and sacrifice, seem trite, absurd, or utterly meaningless. And when the stories died, the will to live, to strive, to connect soon followed. Despair became the common tongue. Societies didn't explode. They just unraveled like a poorly woven tapestry. The Galactic Concord, for all its technological might and collective intellect, was terrified. This was an enemy they couldn't bombard with plasma torpedoes or outthink with supercomputers. The Concord's finest scientific minds, its most sophisticated AI, and its most stringent information security protocols were thrown at the Grey Fade. They tried logical counterarguments, hoping to deconstruct the plague's nihilistic assertions. They initiated data purges, attempting to cleanse their networks of its tendrils. They established information quarantines, isolating affected systems. They built technological firewalls of immense complexity. None of it worked. The Grey Fade wasn't logical, so logic couldn't touch it. It didn't reside in specific data packets that could be deleted, but in the interpretation of data, in the resonance of belief. The firewalls were breached by the simplest of Trojan horses, a familiar folk song, now subtly twisted to drain its warmth, a child's fable, its moral inverted to teach hopelessness. The plague escalated, moving from the periphery to the core worlds. Ancient civilizations, species that had walked among the stars when humanity was still chipping flint, began to crumble. The proud Valanti, whose soaring cities were built on epic poems of flight and freedom, grounded themselves, their wings drooping, their songs forgotten. The hyper-rational Mendaxians, whose society was a perfect equation of input and output, simply ceased to calculate, seeing no further point. Once vibrant alien cities, filled with unique art and bustling commerce, fell silent, their inhabitants wandering like ghosts, disconnected from each other and their own identities. The Grey Fade was a whisper that unmade worlds, not with a bang, but with a sigh of utter indifference. The Concord, the galaxy's bastion of order and reason, was watching itself dissolve into meaninglessness. Amidst the growing despair, a peculiar pattern began to emerge from the data streams reaching the Concord's Emergency Response Council. Human colonies, and even mixed species outposts with substantial human populations, were reporting infections, yes, but the societal collapse, the complete unraveling seen elsewhere, was slower, patchier. In some human-dominated sectors, it was almost negligible. Individuals might succumb to bouts of listlessness, a questioning of the point of it all, the signature touch of the Grey Fade. But their communities, as a whole, were holding together with a stubbornness that defied the plague's relentless advance. This anomaly was too significant to ignore. A specialized Concord research team was hastily assembled. It comprised xenolinguists, memeticists, sociologists, and reluctantly, a few specialists in metacultural theory, a field many considered dangerously close to studying fiction. Among them was archivist Krell, the Zalosian data purist, whose expertise in information patterns was deemed essential, even if Krell privately suspected this was another human-centric wild goose chase. Their mission: travel to a notably resilient human sector, perhaps even to Earth itself, and discover the source of this improbable resistance. The prevailing theories ranged from a unique human neurochemistry to a deeply buried, archaic technological defense left over from some forgotten Earth conflict. They found neither. But the researchers discovered, particularly Krell, whose mind was attuned to the flow and structure of information, was something far stranger, far more human. On the colony world of New Alexandria, a bustling, multicultural hub with a large human majority, the Grey Fade was present. They saw its effects in the tired eyes of some, in the occasional abandoned public art project, in the slightly more subdued tone of the Planetary Information Network. But it hadn't won. Here the plague was being actively, if unconsciously, fought. The humans of New Alexandria were, as always, immersed in narrative. Their public spaces were filled with constantly changing murals, some depicting historical events, others purely fantastical scenes. Their networks buzzed not just with news, but with serialized dramas, amateur music videos, heated debates about the endings of ancient films, and collaborative storytelling forums where thousands contributed to ever-evolving sagas. Children weren't just taught facts, they were told stories, elaborate, engaging tales that often had more to do with courage and kindness than with scientific accuracy. Seniors gathered in parks to recite epic poems, their voices frail, but their eyes bright with remembered passion. Even the graffiti seemed to tell defiant little stories. Krell, accustomed to the sterile, factual data streams of most conquered worlds, was initially overwhelmed. It was a cacophony of informational deviation. But as the Zalosian observed, a new pattern began to emerge from the chaos. Humans weren't just passively consuming old stories. They were in a state of perpetual narrative creation, deconstruction, and reinvention. They argued about the motivations of fictional characters with the same passion they applied to real-world politics. They took ancient myths and twisted them into new shapes, finding fresh meanings in old patterns. Their frivolous, cultural activities, Krell slowly began to realize, were a form of constant, dynamic mimetic exercise. They were exercising their ability to create and sustain meaning. The oh shit moment, as the humans might have termed it, arrived for Krell while observing a very ordinary scene. A human mother was tucking her child into bed. The room was softly lit, and the mother was relating a story, her voice a gentle murmur. It wasn't a pre-recorded tale from an educational datapad. She was improvising, weaving a simple narrative about a lost star critter finding its way home with the help of brave, kind space explorers. The child, eyes wide, occasionally interjected with questions, adding their own small details to the unfolding adventure. Krell's crystalline mind, designed for data, suddenly processed the scene with a new, startling clarity. The grey fade worked by making stories feel empty. But humans didn't just have stories, they were story-making creatures. Their minds were designed to generate meaning, to find patterns, to connect disparate elements into a coherent whole, even if that whole was entirely fictional. Their endless engagement with narrative wasn't a weakness or a frivolity. It was a fundamental aspect of their consciousness, a constantly self-renewing shield against meaninglessness. The mother wasn't just lulling her child to sleep. She was forging a small, bright shield of hope and connection, a tiny, potent countermeme against the encroaching darkness. This wasn't a biological immunity. It was a cultural one, born from a species-wide, deeply ingrained need to tell and be told. The heroes in this battle weren't soldiers with plasma rifles or scientists with equations. They were the poets, the novelists, the songwriters, the playwrights, the painters, the game designers, even the comedians who could find laughter in the face of despair. They were, often unknowingly, the galaxy's foremost mimetic warriors. Their creations, stories of courage in the face of hopelessness, of love transcending loss, of the sheer, stubborn resilience of the individual spirit, were more virulent, in the best possible way, more life-affirming and contagious than the cold nihilism of the grey fade. Humanity was fighting the plague not by denying it, but by outcreating it, by shouting into the void with a million different voices, each telling a story that insisted on meaning. The report from archivist Krell and the research team sent ripples of astonishment, then dawning comprehension, through the highest echelons of the galactic conquered. The idea that frivolous, human art and storytelling held the key to defeating a galaxy-threatening mimetic plague was, to many, preposterous. Yet the evidence was irrefutable. Where logic had failed, narrative was succeeding. Humbled, and with a desperation that overrode generations of pragmatic disdain for the intangible, the conquered made an unprecedented plea. They didn't ask for human technology or military aid. They asked for humanity's artists, its writers, its musicians, its myth-makers. They asked humanity to teach them how to tell stories again, or, for some species, for the very first time with such focused intent. And so, the most unlikely saviors emerged. Poets whose verses had previously only graced university lecture halls now advised alien diplomats. Hollywood directors, once dismissed as mere entertainers, found themselves consulting with planetary governments. Children's authors were sought out for their ability to weave simple, powerful narratives of hope. It was a strange, chaotic, and surprisingly effective call to arms. Human artists, initially bewildered by their sudden galactic importance, rose to the occasion. They began to work with other species, not by imposing Earth stories, but by helping these alien cultures to delve into their own histories, their forgotten myths, their unique ways of seeing the universe, and to forge new narratives or re-energize old ones, capable of resisting the gray fade's insidious whisper. It was not a swift or easy process. Many species lacked humanity's innate, almost turbulent fluency in narrative construction. For some, the concept of fiction as a tool for truth was a profound paradox. But slowly, painstakingly, a change began. Across the conquered, worlds started to rediscover the power of their own voices. New songs were written, epics were composed, plays were performed in newly reconsecrated theaters. The grey fade didn't vanish overnight, but its advance was halted, then slowly, perceptibly reversed, not by a single cure, but by a million points of light, a million stories rekindled. This period became known as the narrative Renaissance. Art, mythology, music, and all forms of cultural expression underwent a profound re-evaluation. They were no longer luxuries or idle pastimes, but were recognized as fundamental pillars of societal health, identity, and resilience. A new pangalactic institution, the Guild of Narrative Weavers, was chartered, with human storytellers initially forming its core faculty, dedicated to the study, preservation, and enrichment of the galaxy's diverse cultural chronicles. Archivist Krell, forever changed by the experience on New Alexandria, returned to the great conquered archives. Krell didn't discard the principles of factual accuracy, but the Zalosians' understanding of information had expanded exponentially. Beside the meticulously ordered stacks of verified data, Krell initiated a new, vibrant wing, the Archive of Living Narratives. It wasn't a static collection, but a dynamic, ever-growing repository of the galaxy's stories, songs, myths, and dreams, recognized now not as informational deviations, but as a profound source of power, wisdom, and enduring spirit. Humanity's place in the conquered was transformed. They were still, by galactic standards, a bit unpredictable, often overly emotional, and their committee meetings could still devolve into passionate, rambling debates that tried the patience of more stoic species. But their frivolous obsession with stories was now viewed with a mixture of awe and deep respect. Humans became the unlikely, and sometimes reluctant, guardians of galactic meaning, their artists and dreamers the new, celebrated champions, in an age that had learned the hard way that logic alone could not sustain a soul or a civilization. Krell, in a quiet moment, accessed a newly acquired human text, a very old one, a collection of poems from a writer named Keats. One line seemed to resonate with a clarity that transcended mere data. Beauty is truth, truth beauty. That is all you know on Earth, and all you need to know. The Zalosians still didn't fully understand it, not in the way Krell understood a star chart or a chemical equation. But now, Krell was beginning to feel its truth. And for a librarian of the conquered, that was the most profound narrative shift of all.